In this video, we're going over how to do a procedural fire effect without the use of any third-party plugins or even keyframes right inside of After Effects. All right, first let's create a black solid and call it BG for background. And then let's add some text and just call it fire for now. And then using the align tool, we'll just make sure that it's centered into our comp. Next, we'll create a solid and call it gradient ramp, and we'll add a gradient ramp effect and swap the colors so that black is on the bottom and white is on the top. After that, let's pre-compose the layer, calling it blur gradient map, and move all attributes into the pre-comp. Then we'll just hide the layer for now, but we'll come back to it in a bit. Next, let's apply a compound blur effect to our text and set it to reference the blur gradient map layer. The gradient we made in the blur map pre-comp tells the compound blur effect what areas to blur, represented by the white values, and what areas not to blur, represented by the black areas, onto the text layer. Then we'll jump into the pre-comp and adjust the gradient start and end points to how tight we want the blur radius to be. Then jumping back into our main comp, we'll turn the compound blur amount down to roughly 10, and if we double click on the effect, it will bring up our compositing options for that effect, where we can adjust the individual effect opacity down so that it only subtly affects that layer. And now we can start getting to the fun part where we start creating the basic motion of our fire effect. Let's create a new solid and name it Fractal Displacement Map, and then add a fractal noise effect. We'll set the fractal type to dynamic and turn on the invert checkbox. And then to start giving the effect some motion, let's animate the evolution parameter by alt-clicking on the stopwatch and typing the expression time times 80 to give it some motion over time. Next, let's animate the sub offset in an upward motion with the expression open bracket 0, comma time times -100 close bracket, where 0 is the horizontal value and time times -100 is the vertical value, and will basically cause only that vertical value to animate upward over time. Then we'll scale up the subscaling to around 70 to make the pattern just a little bit bigger. Now let's pre-comp the layer and call it Fractal Displacement Map, and then we'll turn off this layer for now as well. These map layers we're creating are the basic textured looks that we'll end up applying to the shape of our text. Let's start doing that right now by making a new adjustment layer and calling it Fractal Displacement. We'll add a Gaussian blur effect set to around 20, and then we'll add a CC vector blur effect and set the type to direction fading, the amount to around 150, and the rotation to 180 so that the blur direction goes upward, then set the vector map to reference the background solid layer. Now we'll add a displacement map effect and set it to reference the fractal displacement map layer. Then set the horizontal and vertical displacement values relatively high to start forming that fire shape around the text. Now we'll jump into the fractal displacement map pre-comp and create a middle gray solid. We want to mask out the bottom half of the solid and feather it to create a gradient area of where the displacement won't heavily affect the bottom of the text. Since black values are affected in one direction and white values are affected in another, and middle gray stays relatively unaffected. We're setting this up so that the fire is affecting more of the upper half of the text and less of the base. Then jumping back to the fractal displacement layer, let's add a solid composite effect and set it to black, since we can see that the displacement is affecting the edges of our comp, and this will fill in those fringed areas. Next, let's add a fractal noise effect and animate the offset turbulence with the same expression as before, open bracket 0, comma time times -100 close bracket, and set the effects blending mode to color burn. Then let's set the actual layer blending mode to exclusion, which will give us this cool outline that makes the text look more engulfed. And now we're really starting to see our fire beginning to come to life. Now that we have our basic fire motion set up, we can start adding more distortion detail. Let's create a new solid and call it Distortion Map, and then add a fractal noise effect. And if we go into the Transform tab, let's uncheck the Uniform Scaling checkbox, scale up the height really high, and then we'll increase the contrast a bit. Then let's add a fast blur effect to soften out the harsh lines. After that, we'll add a turbulent displace effect and set the style to twist smoother, bring down the amount a little, and bring up the complexity quite a bit. Then let's animate the offset turbulence of the fractal noise effect with the expression open bracket 0, comma time times -300 close bracket for a little bit faster movement upward. And then let's pick whip the turbulent displace offset to the fractal noise offset to parent the parameters together. Now let's animate the fractal noise evolution with the expression time times 300. And after that, duplicate the turbulent displace to add a bit more detail variety and animate the evolution with the expression time times 30 to start giving some of that glowy, wavy look. And now we'll pre-comp this layer, naming it Distortion Map, and we'll hide it as well. Then jumping into that new pre-comp, we'll do the same thing we did before in the Fractal Displacement pre-comp, adding a gray solid, masking the lower half, and adding feathering. Then just like before, we'll jump back into the main comp and add a new adjustment layer, and this time we'll call it Distortion. Then we'll add a displacement map effect, set it to reference the distortion map, and this time adjust only the horizontal displacement. And at this point, if you want to change any of the aspects of the look that we have so far, all you have to do is go into each map pre-comp and adjust parameters like contrast, displacement amount, blur levels, expression animation speeds, etc. Then once everything looks good, we'll set this layer's blending mode to exclusion as well. And real quick, make sure to join our Patreon to get a ton of perks, including a private VFX Masterminds chat where you can talk to other VFX artists. Link in the description below. Now the next thing we want to do is add just a little bit more of that wrapping around detail, like the fire is really engulfing the text. So let's create another new solid and call it text displace. We'll add a calculations effect and set it to reference the text layer, set it to effects and masks, set the second layer opacity to 100, and set the blending mode to copy, which creates a copied matte of our text layer without needing to do any duplicating or pre-composing and track matting. Next, we'll add a fast box blur effect and set it to 3, and we'll add another fractal noise effect and animate the offset turbulence to that expression we're now used to, open bracket 0, time times -100, close bracket. Then let's add a levels effect and bring down the white value to around middle gray just for a little more naturalism. Then once that's set, we'll turn on the fractal displacement map layer and apply a displacement map effect, set it to reference the text displace layer we just made, set it to effects and masks, and set the horizontal and vertical values both to 100, then set the layer itself to an overlay blending mode. Let's also repeat the same process for the distortion map layer and then turn off the text displace layer. Now we can see that we're getting some of that fringing again on the edges from the displacement effects, so to fix that, let's create an adjustment layer and call it solid composite and add a solid composite effect set to black and place it under the map layers. All right, now that the overall fire effect is made, let's create an overlay effect to give it an extra level of feeling hot by adjusting the lighting and giving it a bit of an overall heat wave look. Create another new solid and call it overlay displace and set it to an overlay blending mode. Then let's add a gradient ramp effect and hit swap colors, and let's bring the black up and the white down to around the midpoints of the text to add some contrast to the darker parts of the base and to the brighter, hotter parts of the fire on top. After that, we'll add a fractal noise effect and set the type to dynamic, turn on invert, and set the contrast to around 170. We'll set the scale to somewhere around 150 to 200, and we'll animate the offset turbulence again with the expression open bracket 0, time times -300, close bracket for a slightly faster upward movement. Then we'll set the blending mode of the fractal noise effect to multiply to blend it with the gradient ramp, and then we'll add a turbulent displace effect and bring the size down to around 25 and animate its offset turbulence by pick whipping it to the offset turbulence of the fractal noise effect. Now real quick, if you're noticing things like the effect on the base being too high up, this is just a result of our vector blur in our fractal displacement layer. We can adjust the blur amount down a bit, or we can even add an offset effect at the bottom and move the vertical position up and down until we're satisfied. And now all we need to do to bring it all to life is add some fire color. We'll create one more adjustment layer and call it color, and then we'll add a curves effect to add a little bit of contrast. Then let's add the colorama effect and set it to the fire preset and blend it with the original to around 25% just to tone things down a bit. Then we'll add a glow effect, set the threshold to around 30, the glow radius to around 250, the intensity to about 2, and we'll change colors to A and B colors and set color A to about a bright orange and color B to a darker red. Then you can go back and adjust any parts of the chain we built to further refine the effect until it looks exactly how you want. That's really the beauty of this procedural way of working. Everything is easily adjustable and super simple to customize once it's all in place.